Let's go ahead and move on. So phone firmware. We're told to enable Hugo Reyes's, extension 1002, and James Ford's phones so that they're able to distribute firmware images to other phones via a peer-to-peer protocol to reduce WAN bandwidth consumption and CUCM TFTP server strain. So we mentioned this a couple weeks back, or if you're watching the hours back, on one of the other deep dive modules, and I believe someone actually asked, how do we do this? I'm not sure if we touched on the answer to that or not at the time, but we're going to take a look at it now. So phone firmware, once you have the Type B phones, okay, so let's just clarify real quickly, within CUCM, we have Type A phones and Type B phones. And of course, all of this is in the documentation for CUCM. Mainly the S or D, I think, covers it the most, but also the system guide probably would. Type A phones are typically the older phones, the Generation 1 and 2 phones. And Type B phones are typically the Generation 3 and Generation 4 phones. So when I say Gen 3, I'm speaking of the 7941s, 42s, 61s, 62s. But the reason we don't just say Gen 3 and newer phones can do this, Gen 2 and older phones cannot, is that there are a few of the older phones, Gen 2 phones, like the 7970, that actually had, it really gets down to how much flash memory they had to be able to store firmware. So the 7940s and 7960s had 2 1 meg flash banks, and they've been pushed to the max with what their firmware can store. 7970s, I believe, had 8 meg. The newer 61s and 41s, actually, don't quote me, I don't remember the exact number, but I think they have 64 meg. But even if it's 16, they have a lot more flash memory. They can store a lot larger firmware files that have a lot newer and more information. So when we say the Type B phones, we're including 7970s in that. I'm trying to think if there's any older phones else that we're including. I don't think so, but at least the 7970s, the ones with more memory that can actually support the newer firmware. So those are the Type B phones that we'll be referring to. I'll typically use Gen 3 and beyond and the term Type B interchangeably, but remember that that includes 7970. Okay, so with these phones, and notice all of the ones that we have here are 7961s, except for one, which is a 7961G-GE, so Gigabit Ethernet. And also remember, I've mentioned before, not during this module, but during others, that in the real actual CCIE Voice Lab, if that's why you're watching this, that the phones that are used there are 7965s. Okay, so 65s are color. There's one additional thing that the 62s can do that the 61s cannot, and that's essentially the wideband speaker in order to actually be able to take use of the G722 codec, or I'm sorry, not the speaker. The speakerphone is already wideband enabled for the 61s. It's also the ILBC or Internet Low Bitrate codec that the 60. But other than that, you can certainly get away with all of the other functionality except for the ILBC codec and a slightly higher quality handset for the lab with 7961s versus having to go out and buy 62s or you know what the lab has, which is 65s. There's really no need for the color display other than maybe the kind of background image you could put on it, but both how to put the different resolution and color versus non-color, the background images are both well documented under the IP phone for that type, IP phone administration guide or user guide. So we'll jump into, I think we were told Hugo Reyes, actually, not Jack Shepard. So corporate headquarter phone 2. And if we scroll down to the bottom, now we're going to notice that we're passing a lot of stuff here on the phone page. Some of the things we'll be covering today. Other things we'll be covering in different deep dive modules as it pertains to that topic. You know, like media resource group list, we'll be covering that, I believe, tomorrow in media. AAR calling search space, we'll cover that under high availability in AAR, actually in dial plan. Okay, built-in bridge and privacy, things like that we'll be covering today. So keep in mind that some of them, as we scroll past them a little bit quickly, you might wonder, well, wait a minute, are we going to cover everything on the phone since we're talking about call features for the phone? And the answer is we will, but we'll cover them as they pertain to the specific modules, but we will cover everything. Also notice that this is a SIP phone. Okay, so we actually do have, let me just go back out to the list. We do have 3 SIP phones here. So branch 2 phone 2, which is a 61 in front of me. Corporate headquarter phone 2, which is a 61 in front of me. And that is, oops, if I can choose the right screen here. That is this phone here, Hugo Reyes. So one other thing to note is that the VoIP integration tool can support skinny and SIP phones. And actually, as of just this last weekend, if you're watching it on recorded, right, a few weeks ago probably, but for those live, it just became able to support, if I click on devices, CME phones as well. So I can now support CME phones as well as as well as CUCM phones. That's going to be really helpful for SRST, CME as SRST, CME standalone, and our PSTN phone, which is based on CME as well. For those of you renting rack time from us and wanting to control the 7961s that we have back in our rack. Speaking of back in our rack, we also have the SIP phone that we converted collectively on the very first day, I believe, which is the corporate headquarter phone 3, and that one actually is back on the rack. Looks like I have branch 1 phone 2 that is, for some reason, that one's also back on the rack, and it's unknown. Probably have the port shut down, but we can take a look at that later. Okay? So we want to go into corporate headquarter phone 2. It's Hugo Reyes' phone. And we were told to enable his phone and also James Ford's phones so they're able to distribute the firmware image to each other via a peer-to-peer protocol. Okay, so if we scroll down, as we were beginning to do, one of the things we come to is product-specific configuration layout. Now let me say something about this on this page. Normally, whenever we have a question about what to configure or what a field name is or what it does or what the value should contain, we typically go to help for this page. However, in an attempt for Cisco to have all of their phones able to use one help for this page, they essentially make it so that the help for this page, let me just go ahead and go here, opens up always comes up for generic settings that are essentially applicable to almost all phones. And when we come down to the bottom, where we would expect to see help for this page, the last few fields that we see are, let's see, add a new BLF speed dial. Actually, we're on to the line association information at this page. So we see DND incoming call alert, secure shell, and secure shell password. We scroll over and scroll down. DND, do not disturb, which we'll be talking about today. Secure shell, user and password. Those are the last bits that we see before we get to association information. Modify button items, which is what we have up over here, association information. Modify button items, okay? After the modify button items, we don't see anything more. But here we have product-specific configuration layout, and we're told to click the question mark. Okay, so if we want to look at information specific to a phone model, like a 7961, it's going to support different features than a 7960, as we just mentioned, type A, type B. 60 is A, 61 is B. So here I can click this question mark, and it brings up a context-sensitive help overlay similar to what we have in enterprise and service parameters. Okay, so that will describe all of the various things that we can do on the phone, like restrict advertising the G722 codec by phone. Okay, so one of the things that we can do here is peer firmware sharing. Again, scroll down to peer firmware sharing, and we see it enables or disables peer-to-peer image distribution, the PPID, Cisco proprietary protocol, in order to allow a single phone in a subnet to retrieve an image firmware and then distribute it to its peers, thus reducing TFTP bandwidth and providing for faster firmware upgrade time. By default, it's disabled. We can enable it, and typically, if we did that, we would do it for one or a couple phones on a remote subnet, not all of them, and then they will essentially, maybe we'd turn on for all of them. Just depends. Whoever got it first, we would then have it turn into a TFTP server, and it would allow for those peer-to-peer distributions. Okay, so that's what we're going to do here. Actually, before we move on, we don't want to do it on Hugo Reyes' phone, so let's go ahead and say OK. Back to the list, and we'll do this again on James Ford phone, which I believe was branch 2, phone 2. Sure, yep, branch 2, phone 2. Scroll down to the bottom. Here, firmware sharing, disabled. We'll change that to enabled. Save, and we would restart those phones. We're not going to test that because we'd actually have to go into upgrading the phones, and that would take a while.